Today I want to create a function in VBA which will take a date as an input and then add a certain amount of days. Then it will check whether it's in the weekend or on a holiday. Then it will find the next eligible day. I'm going to use the 23rd of November as an example, 23, because if I add 30 days to that, that will give me a holiday. And then if I add 1 day to that, that's still a holiday. And then it's also 2 vacation days. And then lastly, we have a normal day. So when I input 23/11/2023 plus 30, I actually want to output 27/12/2023. So that's what I want to do. When creating a function, I have to create a module to house the function. I can't do it inside this workbook. Otherwise, I won't be able to call it. I also want to make a sub, which I can use to call the function inside of VBA in order to test it. And I want it to be a function instead of a sub, because then I can call it like any other function. So I first want my sub that I can use to test, which will simply have some input that I can then call the function with. And I'll just leave the output as variant because I don't want to bother with this function too much. I've decided to call it AddX because when you create your own functions, you can add IntelliSense. So I have to somehow let the user know what to do. And I think that's kind of descriptive here. I want my input to be a string because you can type a date as a date and you can type it as text as I do up here. I could also make it a range. At that point, I would have to reference a cell, which you'll probably do, but I want you to be able to also type it in manually. And then it needs a number. And I want it to be able to be negative, so it has to be integer or long. And this function will actually be part 1 of 2 functions. I've chosen to divide the function into 2 because I want to solve this problem with recursion, and I found this to be a bit easier for me to understand. So I want to have a fixed date as state because I want to convert this into a date and do validation to check that this value can be interpreted as a date. And in case I can't convert it to a date, then that will fail, so I'll go to the fail state. At which point the function will spit out, well, some kind of helper. I want to start out checking that my date can actually be interpreted as the date type. So if the type name of my date is the date type, then I simply want to say fixed date should be equal to my date because it can already be interpreted as a date. And if it's a string like I do up here, then I want to first convert this into a date because a date is actually a number, which is the number of days since the 31st of December 1899, and then that's formatted as a date. And you can also use the date value function instead, but when I did my testing, I found this to be better. You may have to play around with which to use depending on your needs. And I've already taken care of if this fails, in other words, if the type is not date or string, or alternatively, this will fail if the text can't be interpreted as a date, so I don't have to worry about the else, because this will then fail. And then before my on error, I need to call the next function. It should then be my fixed date and then my days to add variable. And I want to add those together and then exit function. I want this function check eligible workdays to be private so a user can't type it into the sheet like normal. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to dim the array of holidays inside of the function. You'd probably want to have a sheet where you define your holidays and then you can load that into the code. But you may also want to define the holidays inside the code, because then only people who know how to open the Visual Basic editor will know how to change the holidays. And you can add a code to the Visual Basic editor if you need to. And I'm going to cheat and copy that in. So I'm defining array of holidays as an array where I'm entering these date values. And here I'm using the date value function to convert the text into the actual date. So actually I'm saying that the 27th is not a holiday. So I want the 27th to be valid. I can check whether the date is a Saturday or Sunday before I check holidays. And I'll always have to check Saturday or Sunday anyway, so I'll do that first. So first I want to check what the current day is. That is my current date, not today, which is stored as an integer, which will be between 1 and 7. So I can leave it as byte. I also want to change the date in case it is a Saturday or Sunday, because then I don't have to check if it's a holiday, because it's not eligible anyway. Then I want to do a check whether the new day is a holiday or not, which is then a boolean, or you could make it byte and then it would be 0 or 1. And then I need a looper because I may have to loop multiple times as I do here because I have multiple holidays in a row. And I can leave that as byte because you probably won't have that many holidays. Then I can do my starting check to say if the current weekday is in the weekday function, takes my current date, and I'll start out with Monday, so 1 is equal to Monday. Then I can say if the current weekday is equal to 6, then it's Saturday. and I need to add 2 to my new date. And if the weekday is Sunday, then I have to add 1. And otherwise, I don't have to do anything. I can do that in one line with a colon and say that the new date should be equal to the current date. And this is just so I can ignore the new date variable after this piece of code. So now I only have to check if the date is a holiday or not. But of course, after the holiday, I might move the date into a weekday, and then I'll have to add days again, which is why this needs to be recursive. So I want to do a loop through my holidays between my lower bound of the array and then the upper bound. If my new date is identical to that value, so I need to do a lookup, then I need to say that, well, this is then a holiday. So I set the variable to be true. And I don't have to set it to false to begin with because I'll only check if it's true. But actually, I think I want to, just for sake of maybe being a bit more clear. And at that point, I can exit the loop because there's no point in continuing to check, because if the first one is true, then the others won't be. So at that point, all I have to say, well, if isInHoliday is true, then I have to recursively call the function until isInHoliday is false, at which point, well, I have a day that isn't a holiday. I want to say if isInHoliday is true, then I need to check a new date. I'll say that the new date should be equal to the recursive call. I call the function again, but this time I add 1 day. So my new date is then the new date variable plus 1. At this point, if I've done everything correct, then I can set the function to be equal to the output, which would then be new date. Before stepping through the function, I want to first check if it actually works, and that's why I wanted this call my func sub. My problem here was that in my call my func function, I said that my date should be a date, but it actually needs to be a string because that's what I do in the function. So I can't have my variable here be a date and here it expects a string. So all I have to do is change that from as date into as string. And if I then call it, I'll get the 28th of November because I said to only add 3 days. But if I add 30, I should get the 27th of December, which I do. So that's very nice. But I want to step through it to show how recursion works in VBA. If you're not familiar with it, I wasn't. That's why I did this. So we can just set a block here and then go through it. So to begin with, my new date is the 25th, because again, the 23rd of November plus 30 would give the 23rd of December, which is a Saturday. So it adds 2 days already because that's a Monday. And then that is a holiday. So it says, okay, you should call the function again, which we will then step through. So it's now executing the path and it's calling the function again, which means my current date has now been incremented by 1. But the 26th is also a holiday. That's what I defined up here. So once again, the value is in the holiday array, meaning once again, it's adding 1 day to the date, which gives me the 27th of December, which is not a holiday. So this doesn't execute, and the function is set to be equal to the current date, which is what it then returns. But then what's trippy is that we're now inside the function, which is inside the function, which is inside the function. So it actually has to go through these steps a few times. Each time it overwrites the current date with the new value until it's gone through all the loops, so to speak. And then it's finally done, and it returns all the way up to the beginning, the function we call from inside the sheet, and then it will spit that out. So I can now test that inside of a normal sheet, and then you'll see a problem which kind of can't be fixed. So I can now call this AddXDays, and I want it to add 30. So it will spit out the date, which is what I asked it to do down here. It says it should spit out a date, but a date again is a number which then gets formatted as a date. And this is what I actually want to output. If you do any kind of dates, you'll notice that you don't actually have to change the formatting, where here it says general. So if I simply say add 30 to that, Excel knows that it needs to be a date, and it knows that if I input a normal date as a text string, it should actually convert that into a date, which is then the number of days that have passed since day 0. And date is actually just a formatting. But a function like this will only output the value, and I can't actually specify the format of the cell. Yeah, you can also see the error here because it's referring to an empty cell, which can't be converted into a date. So that's what I wanted to happen. Here it's copied down the formatting without me asking it to, because Excel is smart enough to understand what I wanted to do, which was to change the formatting, because I dragged the cell value down, which also copied formatting. I just want to reiterate that you'll get a number output, which you then have to change manually. But I think I can live with that, especially if you do like normal. You'd want to drag it down. So it's only a problem the first time you call the function. You can get around this if instead of making a function, you create this function as a sub, at which point you'd call it like any other macro under the developer tab, call the macro, and then you just highlight a cell and highlight the array with the holidays, or if the holidays are stored inside the function. And then you can say that because it's a normal macro, you can manipulate the cell. So you could say change the selected cell's format to be a date, and then it would output the number and then change the formatting. But you can't do that with a function. I just think personally for normal use, this would be better as a function, and then just tell the user, hey, you have to manually go up here and click on date. So, yep,